Sorry that this lecture has two parts. I had a technical difficulty. My lecture just stopped all of a sudden, so here we are picking up again at this example. We've already discussed it, so we'll move on to the next one. Question: if an argument has a false conclusion, it cannot be valid. True or false? False. Validity just says, if the premises are true, then it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. Well, if you have a premise that's false, you might have a conclusion that's false, even if the argument's valid. Let me give you an example. Only rocks have intrinsic moral worth. Trump is a rock. Trump is not a rock. Therefore, Trump does not have intrinsic moral worth. Here's an example where you have a valid deductive argument, because if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. If it's the case that only rocks have intrinsic moral worth, and it's the case that Trump is not a rock, then it follows with certainty that Trump does not have intrinsic moral worth. Now, as it turns out, premise 1 is false, and the conclusion is false. It's not the case that only rocks have intrinsic moral worth. In fact, rocks don't even have intrinsic moral worth, so far as I can tell. And it's not the case that Trump does not have intrinsic moral worth. In virtue of being a member of the human race, Trump has intrinsic moral worth. So there's an example where you have a false conclusion, but a valid argument. Remember, validity just has to do with logical analysis. Here again, we see the distinction between truth value analysis and logical analysis. If we analyze this argument according to truth value, well, there's a false premise. If we analyze it according to its logical structure, we see that the conclusion must follow from true premises. Okay, there are a couple of other properties that deductive arguments have, or can have. A deductive argument might be sound. This is an argument that is valid and has all true premises. This is an argument that is valid and has all true premises. An unsound deductive argument is an argument which is claimed to be deductive, but which is either invalid or at least has one false premise. Okay, so the top argument is valid and sound. All triangles have three sides. This blue object is a triangle. Therefore, this blue object has three sides. That's valid because the conclusion follows from the premises, and it's sound because it's both valid and has true premises. The second argument is valid yet unsound. All squares have 5 sides. This is a square. Therefore, this has 5 sides. This being the blue object to the right. It's valid because if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. But it's unsound because it has a false premise, namely premise 1. Okay. Here's a way to tell whether an argument is sound or unsound. You can answer 2 questions in a particular order. First, you ask, if the premises are assumed to be true in this argument, is it impossible for the conclusion to be false? If the answer is no, then what you're dealing with is an invalid argument, and it's automatically unsound. Because an unsound argument is either invalid or has false premises. If the answer is yes, then you're dealing with a valid argument. However, you need more information to determine whether this argument is sound or unsound. You need to ask, are the premises in fact true? If the answer is no, you have an unsound argument. And that's because an argument that is unsound has either false premises or it's invalid. Here we said that the premises are false, so that automatically makes the argument unsound. If you say yes, then it's sound, because you have a valid argument with true premises. Okay, here are some common valid argument forms. One is modus ponens. Modus ponens has the following structure. If A, then B, A, therefore B. The letters A and B, those stand for any statements whatsoever. Okay, so they're variables. If A, then B, A, therefore B. So let's plug in some statements for A and for B. If it's raining outside, the ground is wet. It's raining outside, therefore the ground is wet. We plugged in it's raining outside for A, and the ground is wet for B. This is a valid argument form. It means that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It's impossible for the conclusion to be false. This is due entirely to the structure of the argument. And the structure of the argument you can see in that top argument. The structure is this: if A, then B, A, therefore B. The validity has nothing to do with whether or not the premises are true. Here's another common valid argument form. Modus tollens. The structure is this: if A, then B, not B, therefore not A. Okay, remember, A and B are variables that can stand for any statement whatsoever. So let's plug in a couple of statements to get an example. For A, we'll plug in it's raining outside. For B, we'll plug in the ground is wet. So we get the following argument. If it's raining outside, the ground is wet. The ground is not wet, therefore it's not raining outside. Just as a matter of logical analysis, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. All right? And we can analyze the structure by looking at that first argument. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. We'll learn how to analyze the structure later on in the class, but for now just know that this is a valid deductive argument. Now let's talk about a few common invalid argument forms. One is affirming the consequent. Affirming the consequent has the following structure. If A, then B, B, therefore A. If we plug in John is a bachelor for A, and John is a male for B, we get the following argument. If John is a bachelor, then John is a male. John is a male, therefore John is a bachelor. Now we know this is invalid because it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. Namely, if John is married. So if John is married, you can see that number one is still true. If John is a bachelor, then John is a male. That just follows from our definition of the term bachelor. And if John is married, and suppose he is male, then 2 is true. Then John is a male. However, if John is married, then we can see that the conclusion is false. If John is married, then John is not a bachelor. So here we have a case where you have true premises and a false conclusion. Whenever you have that, you have an invalid argument, because you have a case where it's possible for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false. Denying the antecedent. This is another common invalid argument form. With this form, it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. Here's the form. If A, then B, not A, therefore not B. Let's plug in John is a bachelor for A and John is a male for B. If John is a bachelor, then John is a male. John is not a bachelor, therefore John is not a male. As in the last example, let's suppose that John is married and John is a male. If John is married and John is a male, well, number 1 is true. If John is a bachelor, then John is a male. But, and number 2, premise 2 is also true. John is not a bachelor, so we have true premises. However, the conclusion is false. John is not a male. That is false because we stipulated that John was a male. So, here you have true premises and a false conclusion, which shows that this is an invalid argument. Let's review. We saw that an argument can go wrong or it can go right in at least 2 ways, by having true premises and by having good form. Having true premises has to do with the truth value of the premises in the argument. Having good form has to do with the logic of the argument. If you do truth value analysis on the premises, you can determine whether the premises are true or whether they're false. If you do logical analysis on the argument, you can determine whether or not the argument has a good form. When it comes to valid deductive arguments, the form of valid deductive arguments are such that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And a sound deductive argument is valid and has true premises. That's all I have for now. Thank you.